Ryan Hamlet once wrote, "As the nights grow crisp and cool, the coming fall always reminds me of my childhood in Irvington. And in an area with its fair share of history and haunts, there is a single building that stands alone in my mind as an example of something both beautiful and ominous. Riding in the back seat to pick up my father from work on Downey Avenue, I always craned my neck to catch a glimpse of the giant white house with the imposing white columns. It was only later that I would learn the history of the house on University Avenue and understand that my misgivings were correct. I speak, of course, of the Graham-Stephenson house." The house was built in 1889 by Kentland, Indiana attorney and Civil War veteran William H. Graham for he and his wife Ellen. However, Graham passed away shortly thereafter in 1906, leaving Ellen alone in the huge house. Ellen invited her sister to live with her, but the house was simply too big. In 1920, Ellen decided to rent out her mansion to the Kappa Kappa Gamma sorority and later Phi Delta Theta fraternity of Butler University. After 5 years of housing students, Mrs. Graham decided to sell the mansion. This was the decision that would seal its infamy and add a second surname to the house's identity. While it's uncertain she knew the background or character of the Texan who bought her house, she did live long enough to see his misdeeds play out in the papers, passing away in 1940. David Curtis Stevenson was born in Houston, Texas in 1891, worked as a printer's apprentice as a youth, enlisted in the Army and served as a second lieutenant during World War I, and moved to Evansville, Indiana in 1920 working with a retail coal company. While in Evansville, Stevenson was recruited by fellow Texan Joseph Huffington to join the Ku Klux Klan. He then relocated to Indianapolis. Upon purchasing the Graham's house in 1922, Stevenson quickly renovated it. He removed the one-story columned porch and added a two-story portico, its grand columns portraying the sense of power that D.C. had come to enjoy. While in Indianapolis, he helped increase the scope of the Indiana Klan, offering Protestant ministers free membership and helping to create the Klan newspaper, The Fiery Cross. When Klan recruiter Hiram Evans unseated Simmons as the Imperial Wizard of the National KKK, Evans appointed Stevenson as the Grand Dragon of the Indiana Klan. As the Klan grew in Indiana, Stevenson's power began to extend both to the State House and City Hall. Stevenson was also known as an outspoken prohibitionist and defender of Protestant womanhood, but behind closed doors, he was an alcoholic and sexual predator. Parties in his new mansion. Now privately owned, the home is not open to visitors. However, intrigued by the home's historical significance, we headed to the Irvington Historical Society. While we were there, we met with the historian and president of the society, Steve Barnett.
The house is on the National Register of Historic Places. It's one of those places that communities you're not necessarily proud of, and they want to celebrate instances that occur in different buildings or houses or places in a community. But this is part of history. It's a fact of life, and that it's a site that stands today. The house was built in 1889 by William Henry Harrison Graham. And he was a Civil War veteran and moved to Irvington because Butler College was located here at the time. And a lot of people did that. They would just pick up and move to a community where their kids could go to college. And so he may well have decided to do that. And he built the house. Of course, the house, when he built it, did not look anything like it looks today. The pillars were added by D.C. Stevenson. And this D.C. Stevenson that acquired the property about 1923. And at that time, Stevenson, Grand Dragon, and Ku Klux Klan. He may have decided to come to Irvington to live because Irvington at that time was known as the classic suburb. One of the major thing he did to the house was to add the front portico with pillars in it. And if you look at pictures of the time of the Klan headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia, the Stephenson house on the Klan headquarters in Georgia almost looked identical. So he was trying to replicate that. In 1924, the Klan was kind of in its heyday here in Indiana as a political force. The Klan endorsed candidates in the 1924 primary election, and the governor, Ed Jackson, who was elected in 1924, lived friend of Stephenson's, was endorsed by the Klan, and was, like I said, elected.
County Prosecutor William Remy, one of the few public officials not bribed by Stephenson, charged the Klansmen with rape, kidnapping, and second-degree murder of Martha Oberholzer, for which he was convicted.
The story with Madge Oberholzer, and Madge was worked for the Indiana Department of Education, and so she traveled around the state promoting reading with children, and she met Stephenson in January of 1925 at the inauguration of governor. And on March of 1925, when she came home, it was a Sunday evening, she came home late and was told that Stephenson called and wanted to see her. Stephenson had come up with this idea of promoting a childhood nutrition book, and he wanted it to be available through the public schools, and this is basically, it was a money-making idea that he had. So it was not much of an altruistic venture at all. So he used the ruse of wanting to talk to her about the book, and he was needed to see her that evening because he was going to leave town for a while. So he sends a couple of his henchmen over to her house and escorts her back to the Stephenson. She finds herself in the house, so she's the only woman present. The rest of the Stephenson henchmen, the only other people there. They induce her to drink some punch or whatever that was laced, and so she basically is overpowered, and they take her down to the train station, gets off the train. They stop in East Chicago and get off the train, check into a hotel, and that's when she makes an excuse to go out to buy a hat. She wanted to buy a hat, so she goes out, and actually what she does buys bichloride of mercury tablets. Was basically used for an antiseptic. You could not take the tablets directly; they were deadly. And in fact, they were little blue tablets shaped like coffins. He goes back to the hotel, takes 6 tablets, and becomes violently ill. Stevenson calls for a car, and they drive back to Indianapolis. And in the drive back to Indianapolis, she was wanting to see a doctor who basically refused to give her medical attention. And so they come back to Indianapolis, and the garage that's behind the house, the Stevenson house, the garage there has an upstairs apartment to it. And so she was taken and put into the upstairs apartment, which they left her for a little over a day, and before taking her home. Dr. Kingsbury, the family doctor, determined that she was not going to recover. And so for about a month, she lingered before dying. And during this time, she consented to give a deathbed statement as to what happened on the trip to Chicago and back. And that statement was then subsequently used in Stevenson's trial. It was the first example of a deathbed statement being admitted to the courts. And in law schools across the country today, that's taught as an example. One of the things that was fortunate at the time in Indianapolis was that there was a vacancy in the Marion County Prosecutor's Office. Stevenson wanted to have his own person put into that office. He got the assistance of Ed Jackson, who was the Secretary of of State, to go to Governor McCrae with an envelope. And Jackson told McCrae that Stephenson would like to have this person appointed as Marion County prosecutor, and slipped the envelope across the desk. And McCrae said, "Well, I may be going to jail, but at least I have some honor left," and he pushed the envelope back. And so McCrae appointed another person to be Marion County prosecutor, but not Stephenson's choice. So, come the 1925, you have Marion County prosecutor who's looking into this incident with Madge Oberholzer, who is not friendly to the Klan, and so he brings charges against Stephenson for assaulting Madge Oberholzer and her subsequent death. If things had gone the other way back in 1923, who knows, the history would have been much different. You would have had someone favorable to Stephenson who might have just slid the whole thing under the table. So anyway, Stephenson is tried and convicted and sent to prison. The other thing that was interesting was that Marion County at the time had one of the few licensed, trained pathologists in the country here in Indianapolis. And the Marion County coroner, who was in the pocket of the Klan, he deemed that Madge Oberholzer had died from her self-inflicted taking of the bichloride mercury tablets. So basically she committed suicide. This pathologist, he countered and said, no, actually what contributed to her death was infections caused by Stephenson's attack on her. She had been bitten on various parts of the body, and the pathologist basically said she died of a staph infection produced by these wounds that Stevenson inflicted. And so that was basically the reason one of the main reasons he was convicted and was sent to prison.
Abandoned by the very city officials he helped elect, Stephenson released records on public officials who had been on the Klan payroll to the Indianapolis Times, who later received a Pulitzer Prize for their investigation into Klan corruption.
There were a couple of black boxes, though, not connected directly to the house, but Stephenson kept IOUs, essentially. When he extended Klan support to a politician, he would extract some sort of an IOU, and that was basically, depending upon the person, the office that the person was seeking, it might have been where Stephenson got kickbacks on contracts or some way in which that politician was going to help enrich Stephenson. And after Stephenson was sentenced to prison, he thought his friends, his governor, the friend of the governor, might pardon him. He thought that there was others that would come to his rescue and out of prison. And after a year or so of that not occurring, he decided that he would spill the beans. And so he had his henchmen, one of his henchmen from Evansville, meet Deputy Marion County Prosecutor at a round barn in southern Indiana one weekend, and that's where they exchanged a couple of black boxes that had all these IOUs in them. And after those IOUs were examined, then there were a number of prosecutions around the state of Indiana, including the mayor of Indianapolis. So that's essentially what brought the downfall of the Klan in Indiana. Stephenson stayed in prison until the early 1950s. He was given a grant of parole told him not to leave the state, which he promptly left the state. So he was arrested and brought back and put back into prison again. And a couple of years later, he finally was released and told to leave the state, never showed his face in the state again. And he subsequently went to end up in Tennessee, where he died about 1963, I think it was. And for his service in World War I, which was basically all stateside, he was then buried in a different cemetery. So that's essentially the story of the house and Stephenson.
Stephenson's trial and ensuing political scandal was the death of the Klan in Indiana. Its membership dwindled as fast as it swelled throughout the 1920s.